Welcome you all to the English channel, and this is our very first video on the issue which is happening in the Middle East. Then we'll try to understand that why Iran and Israel are perpetually having an issue. We will also focus on understanding that what exactly is the root cause of the crisis in the Middle East. So let me explain to you by giving you a brief background about the history that will place the things in a context and make your understanding better. The video is likely to be a slightly long video, but if you bear with me for some time, you'll be able to appreciate and understand the things in a much better way. The story actually goes back to 1980. 1979 is a very defining year in the history of the world, because in 1979 what happened at that time was that Iran till then was an ally of US, but in 1979 Iran had a revolution, and after this Iranian revolution it became an anti-US country. So obviously, if Iran became anti-US in 1979, the Americans now wanted to take a revenge against Iran. The best way to do that was to use the immediate geographical locational player, which was basically at that time Iraq. Iraq at that time was led by a Sunni Muslim who was an ally of the American, and his name was basically Saddam Hussein. Saddam Hussein, who was a Sunni, was controlling Iraq. Now, Iraq is a very interesting country to know, because Iraq's 65% population is Shia, whereas 35% population is Sunni, and more importantly, Saddam Hussein, being a Sunni, controlled the larger population, including the Shias, who had no resentment against Saddam Hussein at that time. So it was a very well controlled society. America decided to basically use Iraq to target Iran. In order to do that, in 1980 they supplied Iraq and Saddam Hussein with arms, ammunition, weapons, money, and then told Saddam Hussein that why don't you use these arms, ammunition, money, etc. that we have given you to wage a war against Iran and weaken the Iranian government, which has just now turned against the Americans. So as a result of which, consequently in 1980 the Iran-Iraq war began, and this Iran-Iraq war, which began in 1980, continued all the way till 1988. Nobody won this war, nobody lost the war, but at the end of the day in 1988, when the Cold War came to an end, the Americans, number one, decided to stop the support to Saddam Hussein. They decided to move back. But the consequence also at that time was that Iran understood a very crucial thing. They understood that Americans, against whom we have now turned up today, are not going to let us live peacefully even in the future. They will continue to trouble us. So Iran now decided that we need to actually have access to something which will prevent the Americans to trouble us. And the only thing that the Iranians realized that what could that thing be was basically the nuclear weapon. And it is in this context that post 1988 Iran began to search for nuclear technologies, and specifically those technologies which could help Iran to establish a nuclear bomb. Now, obviously no country is going to help Iran to establish a nuclear bomb, but at that time one of the Pakistani nuclear scientists, whose name was Abdul Qadir Khan, was actually running a nuclear black arms bazaar. And it is in this nuclear black arms bazaar that Iran became one of the first customers of Abdul Qadir Khan. They started seeking his support, and with that support they started building their own nuclear bomb. It was by 2005 that Iranian president at that time, Mohammad Ahmadinejad, he went on to announce in front of the entire global community that Iran has not only acquired nuclear weapon capability, but he went on to even say in 2005 that at that time it is this capability that we have that will prevent anybody to blackmail us. He went on to even argue that now Iran can assemble a nuclear bomb at a very short notice. So when Iran made this public kind of a announcement in front of the global community in 2005, it came as a deep shock for the Israelis, who had always been having a nuclear weapon, but that nuclear weapon was basically kept in a very ambiguous state. So Israel was one of the first countries affected, because it said that if Iran is going to have a nuclear weapon, it's going to be a threat to us. But the bigger threat was also to the Sunni Saudi Arabia, because they did not have a weapon. So Saudi Arabians at that time thought that if we don't have a weapon, whereas if Iran has a weapon and if Israel has a weapon, then everybody else except the Sunnis will have a weapon. So what about us? So Americans at that time got very perplexed. Americans thought that if Iran is going to have a weapon, then obviously this is going to create a nuclear arms race in the Middle East. So in order to prevent that nuclear arms race in the Middle East, it is in 2006 that American government started thinking in a very new way with respect to Iran. Now in 2006 what happened is that American president Barack Obama at that time thought that let me try to convince Iran, let me go for a nuclear deal with Iran in the long run, and if I am able to convince Iran in the long run that okay, if you want to use nuclear technologies, you do it for peaceful purposes, but don't use the nuclear technologies for a nuclear bomb, because it is going to create a nuclear arms race. So with this thought in mind, Obama administration decided to engage with Iran, and they wanted to convince Iran that okay, give up your weapons, have nuclear technology, but keep it for peaceful purpose, not for the military purpose. So with this kind of a thought in mind, the American President Obama in 2006 started a back channel diplomatic dialogue with Iran, and he tried to basically convince Iran to do this. But it is in 2007 that another thing happened. In 2007, what happened was that the Central Intelligence Agency, CIA of US, they published a lot of reports in America and gave them to American president. In those reports, it was found in 2007 that Iran, Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and all the way up till the West Bank territory, which is in Palestine, these areas have a lot of gas. Now, Iran already had a lot of oil, they already had a lot of gas, but the 2007 report said that Iran has so much of gas, natural gas, that they are going to become the most crucial and most geopolitically important country in the future. And along with that, the report also said that there are tons of reserves of natural gas found even in Syria, even in Lebanon, and for that matter, even in Iraq to some extent, and all the way up till the West Bank territory, which is basically the Palestine territory. Now, at that time, Americans immediately got into a panic mode, because the Americans realized that see, the largest reserves of natural gas in the world today are with Russia. Russia always is anyway very close to Iran. Iran already has a lot of natural gas. If Iraq, if Syria, if Lebanon, if at the same time the Palestine territory, West Bank area, if these people form a coalition, and if these people after establishing a coalition now start selling the natural gas, which is going to be the future gas, then our hegemony in the region is going to decline. Who will basically listen to us in the future? Israel also got into a panic mode when this report came out, because Israel said ki boss, if these people, and if Iran specifically with a nuclear weapon tomorrow becomes the major gas supplier, who will listen to us in the entire region? So our influence will also decline. So it is in 2008 and 9 now a huge discussion happened that what do we do? How do we try to ensure that this coalition of Russia, Iran, Iraq, Syria, and also Lebanon and all these countries does not materialize, so that the American hegemony basically remains intact in the region? But at that time, in order to ensure that this coalition does not emerge, the Americans now played a very dirty game. What they did was at that time that they decided that fine, we are going to create instability in the entire region. The best way to create instability in the entire region was that Obama administration at that time initiated, along with the pet project of the CIA, in 2011 called the Arab Spring. Now, if you see what happened in 2011 is that idea of US at that time was very clear. Let's orchestrate Arab Spring, let's create Arab Spring, let's create Arab Spring through social media. It will give us a testing ground to see how social media can be utilized as a tool to basically make the regimes fall. If this social media tool works, tomorrow we can apply the same strategy to bring about a regime change in China if the need be. But let's see how the social media works. So Obama administration at that time had one clear goal in mind, that fine, I want to use the social media strategy to make regimes fall in the Middle East too. The other objective of the Arab Spring was that once the regimes start crumbling in the Middle East, and all those regimes which are in and around Iran, it will create a pressure, psychological pressure on Iran, that tomorrow your regime is also going to fall. So with this larger thought process in 2011, these people created the Arab Spring, the Americans. Now what happened is that when the Arab Spring started, the bigger problem was that it started happening in Tunisia, Morocco, Egypt, but the most crucial territory where the Arab Spring happened, and it continues till today, is basically the territory of Syria. And don't forget, Syria is the same territory in 2007 where a large amount of oil was discovered. And why Syria also matters is that please try to understand, if you look at the map of the entire region, Syria is very strategically placed, that it is just in a place where below Syria is Iran and above Syria is Russia. So the location and geographical location of Syria is such that if tomorrow there is a coalition formed between Russia, Syria, Iran, then this kind of a coalition will ensure that Syria becomes the fulcrum point for basically the trade of gas on the left hand side to Europe, and on the right hand side to the markets of Asia, to India and China. So objective of US was very clear. The Americans wanted to destabilize Syria. They wanted to destabilize Syria with the larger intent that if Syria becomes unstable, and in the long run if we partition Syria or maybe break it into pieces, then one thing is very clear, that number one, Russia, Iran will not be able to supply gas from Russia, Syria, Iran, Iraq, Lebanon to European markets, and also at the same time they'll not be able to supply gas to the Asian markets, including to China and India. And it is at this juncture, when the Arab Spring began in 2011, that Syria became a hotly contested territory. But the larger issue was that this Arab Spring started from Syria, it spread over to Morocco, it spread to Tunisia, it started happening in Egypt. And then it created alarm bells even in Saudi Arabia, because Saudi Arabia at that time very clearly thought, and they in fact told the Americans, that this kind of a project that you are running in the name of Arab Spring, tomorrow if this Arab Spring enters into Saudi Arabia, then this Arab Spring in Saudi Arabia is going to create instability for our monarchy. Why don't you unfortunately roll it back? We don't like this Arab Spring. So 2012, we also saw at that time that the relationship between Saudi Arabia and America, they started nosediving, it started declining. Because the Saudi Arabians were certainly not happy with the Arab Spring movement championed by the Americans. They wanted it to be closed immediately. But when in 2012 Americans were focusing more on the Arab Spring part in the Syrian territory, it is at this juncture that Russia, Iran both realized the American game. Now what happened is, at one place Obama was doing a back channel diplomacy, trying to give Iran a nuclear deal, trying to convince Iran through the nuclear deal by sweetening the deal in this manner, by saying that okay, you use your nuclear technologies for peaceful purpose, not for a bomb, but then don't form a coalition of natural gas with Russia, with Syria, but rather form a coalition of natural gas with Qatar, Turkey and us. So Americans were playing a double game. At one place they were creating pressure on Iran by creating instability in a territory near Iran, which is Syria, through the Arab Spring, and at the same time they were basically arguing with Iran a nuclear deal, negotiating a nuclear deal, and that nuclear deal was not only to curtail Iranian nuclear bomb ambition, but that nuclear deal was also driven with the motive of eventually convincing Iran not to join hands with the Russians or the Chinese or the Syrians or the Lebanese, and ensure that actually Iran signs a gas deal with Qatar, which is an ally of the US, with Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, so that Qatar, Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, America, Turkey, all these people then eventually become the suppliers of natural gas along with Iran to Europe. So the idea of basically the Arab Spring was not only to put pressure on Iran, but also to convince Iran not to join hands with the Russians, because the Americans and the Russians are basically hardcore enemies of each other. So idea was to also pull away Iran from falling into the orbit of the Russians at that side. So it is in this backdrop when the Iranians actually realized the true game of the Americans, that they refused this option. But the problem was that by 2012-13 the Iranians had already signed the nuclear deal. But after nuclear deal, when they refused this option, so America did not enter into a panic mode. America still tried to convince, till 2015 they tried to convince, Obama administration till 2015 tried to convince Iran that see, your long run future does not lie with Russia, your long run future does not lie with China. But at that time Iranians were very cautious. They were cautious because they were seeing that in every state around them there was a huge regime change happening. Every state around them, including in Syria, the Arab Spring was being championed and it was being seen as a pressure tactic of the Americans. So, you cannot put a gun and at the same time say that, okay, sign a peaceful deal with me. This is what the Americans were trying to do. And it is in this backdrop that by 2015, when Obama failed to champion Iran and failed to convince Iran that okay, don't fall into the orbit of the Russians but rather come with us, that Americans finally gave up. And that is why in 2016 when Donald Trump got elected, the very first thing he said is that okay, if Iran is not going to change their behavior, if they want to fall into the orbit of the Russians and want to engage with them, then I am not going to keep the nuclear deal intact. And that's why now, if you will understand that the moment Trump came to power in America, the very first thing that he did in his foreign policy was that he cancelled the Iranian nuclear deal. So that was a pressure tactic, and in fact Iran actually wanted that to happen, because the moment the nuclear deal was cancelled by Trump, now Iran got the access to engage with Russians and the Chinese who were waiting for this opportunity, and then now this coalition began to informally emerge. But At the same time, there was another issue. The issue was that when Arab Spring was being resented by the hardcore ally of the Americans, which were the Saudi Arabians, Americans were also under a deep pressure to do something in Syria other than the Arab Spring. But now the problem was that they had already started the Arab Spring in 2011, so they couldn't control it now because it had gone out of control. Now, if they could not control it, now they decided to actually create more violence in specifically Syria. And to do this more violence, they, along with the Israelis, now championed the creation of the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria in 2014. And through the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, violence at an aggressive level began in Syria. It began in Iraq. And when Trump came, Trump was one of the persons who basically did not do anything to stop ISIS to do this violence in Iraq and Syria, because Trump was very clear. The more violence happens in Iraq and Syria through the ISIS, whom we indirectly support, one thing will become very clear at that level, that it will act as a pressure point on Iran, because Iran will not go into the lap of the Russians or the Chinese, and therefore as a result of which, Iran will remain under constant pressure. But because the Iranians are smart people, Iranians are not dumb like the Saudi Arabians, they are smart people. They right from the 1980s had understood one thing. They understood the fact that Americans will not let them live peacefully unless or until they become allies of America, and they were dead clear on this point that come what may, we will not become the allies of America. That is the reason why since 1980s, Americans who were trying to trouble Iran, Iran at that level had already developed a larger thought process of circumventing the Americans. And they knew that a day will not be far that when America will try to economically also isolate us. Now when after Donald Trump cancelled the nuclear deal of Iran, America started openly saying that we will economically isolate Iran, and Iran had already prepared for this economic isolation since 1980s. They had already created a lot of proxy groups, and now was the time for Iran to use these low cost proxy groups to basically create more trouble amongst all the allies of Americans. Now what did Iran do after 2015? So post 2015, Iran adopted a very unique strategy. They had since 1980s nurtured in a territory called Lebanon a group known as Hezbollah. Hezbollah was led by Hassan Nasrallah, and it is led by Hassan Nasrallah even today. Iran had been supporting Hezbollah for a very simple reason. They understood one thing, that Lebanon is just next to Israel. And if Lebanon is next to Israel, and if Israel is an ally of America, I need to keep a check on Israel. The Iranians knew one thing, that the best way to keep a check on Israel is through Lebanon. In Lebanon, they supported a group known as Hezbollah. Now, you know, in Lebanon, what is the case? The case is that in Lebanon, we already have a lot of people who are Shias. So, Iran basically created Hezbollah, supported Hezbollah to emerge as a party, as a political party that will champion the interests of the Shias in Lebanon. So, Hezbollah emerged as a political party, and it continued to remain a political party for a very long period of time as a legitimate political actor in entire territory of Lebanon, so that it could champion the interest of the Shias. And gradually Hezbollah managed to enter the power structure of Lebanon. And as Hezbollah entered the power structure of Lebanon, by championing the interest of the Shias, they became a legitimate political actor. But Iran also had a double game in mind. When they supported Hezbollah, they also ensured another thing. They ensured very categorically that Hezbollah eventually creates a covert military unit along with it. And today, Hezbollah also has a covert military unit which is making Hezbollah look like a terrorist organization more rather than that of a political outfit, because it is this military covert unit of Hezbollah today that continues to target Israel. And now you will understand that why Israel and Lebanon have a perpetual problem. The problem is not that Iran basically has anything against Israel per se, but because Israel is an ally of the Americans and Israelis today do not like the Iranians, they have been at the forefront of basically decimating the Iranian nuclear program. That is why today Iran basically supports Lebanon, and they support in Lebanon specifically Hezbollah, and they basically empower Hezbollah with all arms, ammunition, rockets which they use today to target Israel, number one. So that is how Americans and their influence in the Middle East gets cut, number one. Number two, the second important thing is that Iran also prepared a long-term game. They understood that Saudi Arabians are again my hardcore enemies, and because Saudi Arabians have always been in the hands of the basically Americans, the Iranians also knew one thing, that a time will not be far away that when, in order to counter me, that is in order to counter Iran, Iran also knew one thing, that America will go to the extent of bringing the Sunni Muslims or the Saudi Arabians, UAE and Israel together. And in order to prevent that to happen, and in order to make sure that Saudi Arabia also does not act as a threat to Iran, because from the Iranian perspective, if you look at the Iranian perspective, they today look at Saudi Arabia as crypto Jews. For them, the Saudi Arabians, UAEs are nothing but crypto Jews. So as a result of which, one thing is very clear, that one thing is that in order to tackle Saudi Arabia, Iran also did the next thing. What did Iran do? Iran basically identified Yemen. In Yemen, again, there are Shias. To target Saudi Arabia, they started supporting these Shias in Yemen, and Yemen, which is a territory bordering Saudi Arabia. Now see the beauty. In Yemen, they have created a group of these Shias, which is today called Ansar Allah. And these Ansar Allah group people are today known as the Houthis. So who are these Houthi rebels? They are Shias. Who are these Houthi rebels part of? They are part of Ansar Allah. And who is supporting them? Iran. Now why is Iran supporting these Shias or the Houthis or the Ansar Allah group? Because in Yemen, if these people are backed by Iranian regime, and if they start troubling Saudi Arabia, then Saudi Arabians and their resources will get diverted towards Yemen. And if Saudi Arabia, UAE remain busy targeting Yemen, if Israel remains busy targeting Hezbollah in Lebanon, Iran has a clean space to explore by backing Bashar al-Assad in Syria, also at the same time allowing Russia to back Bashar al-Assad, and then long run game is very clear that we will basically create a gas coalition. Now, Iran also understood one thing. Iran understood that if I create Hezbollah and allow Hezbollah to target Israel, if I create Houthis, support them, and they target Saudi Arabia and UAE, America will do one more thing. America will then try to trouble me by using another one of their old historical allies called Pakistan. Now I have to counter Pakistan. How do I counter Pakistan? This is the place where Iran decided to play a game with Afghanistan to target Pakistan. How? In 2021, when Taliban took over Afghanistan, Taliban is a Sunni group. The very first thing at that time what happened was that when Taliban took over Afghanistan, the first response of the Americans was, we do not support the Talibanis. Absolutely fine. If you do not support the Talibanis, though you created them, that's a different story altogether. But if you don't support Talibanis, Iran took this opportunity. And the very first thing Iran did was, they started telling the Talibani people, indirectly, we are with you. At the back end level, we are with you. And they in fact told the Talibanis, you please give us a bunch of your hardcore fighters who are today anti-Pakistan. Taliban is a group which has a lot of people within their group who are hardcore anti-Pakistan. And those people who are anti-Pakistan were mobilized by Iran under the Zainab unit. And this Zainab unit, this unit which they created, the Zainab unit, Fatima unit, these units were then nurtured by Iran amongst Taliban, amongst Pakistanis who are against Pakistan, and amongst the Talibanis who are against Pakistan to keep a check upon Pakistan. So as a result of which, it will become very difficult for the Americans also today to openly back Pakistan. One thing is now very clear, that whatever is happening in the Middle East, these confrontations which are happening in the Middle East, you will be now able to understand very clearly that firstly, Syria is the main battleground. Then why is Syria the main battleground? Because the geographical location of Syria is such that today Syria is being backed by the Russians and the Iranians both. Russia and Iran both want to ensure that a gas coalition emerges in the future. China not directly but is indirectly involved in backing this entire gas coalition, because China wants to also remain as one of the infrastructure pipeline creators. India wants access to these gas pipelines, gas from this area, and they want to create a gas coalition so that they supply entirely gas to Europe, to Asia. 2. Any confrontation which is happening between Israel, Iran today, and is backed by America, indirectly backing Israel, and all these crypto Jews who are the Saudis, UAEs backing Israel in America, is done with the larger intent of not allowing this gas coalition in the future to emerge. So while these sparks are emerging in front of you right now, but don't forget the larger geopolitics at play is a gas coalition which America does not want it to materialize. The only goal that the Americans have is very clear. Everything will stop. All this violence will stop. Trust me. If today Iran goes and stand up and says that fine, I am not aligning with Russia or China, if Iran today stands up and says, or if America is able to install a regime in Iran through a regime change which actually stands up and says that fine, I am not joining Russia or China, I am joining Qatar and I am joining Turkey and I am basically working with America now, and I want to basically be a part of the larger American alliance in the region to supply gas to Europe, trust me, every conflict will come to an end. So the larger root cause of all this conflict happening here is the gas politics at play, and gas is going to be the future fuel. And till the time we do not resolve this issue as to who will control the gas, this issue will not get resolved. Because Americans have always enjoyed the monopoly over oil, Americans today want to enjoy the monopoly over gas. But the problem is that the Russians, Chinese and Iranians today are hell-bent upon ensuring that Americans do not enjoy this monopoly over gas, because they want to ensure that if 20th century was the century of the Americans and the British, then the 21st century is going to be the century of the Asians, led by the Russians and the Iranians. So this is what the entire conflict is, and I hope now you'll be able to better understand the Middle East. And do comment in the video and let me know how your experience was about learning this, and I'll keep posting more videos in English so that we cater to a larger audience and we are able to inform them and have them more informed geopolitical understanding. Thank you.